Your name is Mary.
You're 28 years old, 5'4", and 170 pounds. You don't smoke or drink. You just consume the standard American diet. You've just delivered a 10-pound baby, and your delivery nurses are cheering you on.
And after giving birth, you notice relatively high blood sugar. You're having trouble losing the baby weight, but not to worry, this is quite normal. So you carry on living your life.
Until 35 years later, when you discover lumps in your breast tissue and bone aches. You meet with your doctor, who takes a biopsy, and tells you that you have stage 4 breast cancer that has metastasized throughout your skeletal system. He tells you that immediate, aggressive chemotherapy is necessary to increase your chances of living one more year to 50%. You have insurance, but the out-of-pocket cost is more than you can spare, and the side effects make you feel worse. You feel like the victim of terrible luck.
Now let's analyze Mary's health history.
At 28, Mary was the height and weight of the average American female. Like 80% of American adults, Mary was overweight to obese. She consumed the standard American diet, of which 60 to 90% is ultra-processed food, and is composed of mostly carbohydrates. Her baby weighed 10 pounds, which is an early warning sign of the mother's metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance. Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 63, the average age that an American woman is diagnosed with breast cancer, which is highly related to metabolic dysfunction and reversible metabolic biomarkers.
So since young adulthood, it was clear that Mary was metabolically unhealthy and unable to process the heavy loads of carbohydrates and sugars in her diet. Now, her doctors could have alerted her to the issue then, but didn't. Why?
Let's back up. Until World War II, far more American soldiers died from infection than from bullets. The drug that changed the nature of war forever was penicillin. So pharma became widely respected and credited with helping us win the war, appropriately so. Meanwhile, many farmers and farmhands were deployed as World War II soldiers, and so once the war was over, there was a serious labor shortage. Without manpower, farmers needed to accelerate the use of farm equipment. Monocropping was born. With monocropping, a farmer could buy a few pieces of specialized equipment for one type of crop and didn't have to pay nearly as many farmhands. Monocropping was much more profitable than the previous system of regenerative farming, which prioritized biodiversity and had higher crop output, but required much more labor. Now, the disadvantages of monocropping include the demand for pesticides and soil depletion. Disease moves quickly through monoculture, so the crops must be sprayed with pesticides, and as pathogens and insects develop pesticide resistance, farmers must spray stronger and stronger pesticides. And as the same crop is planted over and over, it strips the soil so much that today, an American-grown tomato is 70% less dense in many key nutrients than it was 50 years ago. Now, simultaneously came the baby boom, which introduced two major milestones. One, many of the women who left the home to work during the war continued to work on top of being new mothers, and thus there was an increased demand for shelf-stable, packaged convenience foods, which sparked the rise in processed foods. Two, a smaller counterculture wanted smaller families, giving women more freedom to work, and in 1960, the FDA approved the birth control pill, the first ever medication that could be taken for more than a few weeks at a time.
So in short, post-World War II, 1. Pharma was regarded by the public as miraculous for saving our soldiers. 2. Industrial monoculture farming became the norm, which produced crops with more pesticides and less nutrient density. 3. As more women entered the workforce, processed packaged convenience foods were on the rise. And 4. The first ever long-term medication was introduced.
Shortly after, research criticizing the rise in processed foods began to emerge due to growing evidence that one of the primary ingredients, sugar, caused coronary heart disease. So in 1965, the Sugar Research Foundation paid Harvard to debunk the anti-sugar studies, then funded the Harvard Nutrition School, which would eventually provide the research that would be the basis of the USDA's food pyramid in the 90s. Meanwhile, Congress banned cigarette ads in the 70s, and by the 80s, smoking greatly decreased. So the tobacco giants, like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, bought the largest food companies, like Kraft Heinz and Nabisco, and transferred their thousands of scientists, who are essentially addiction experts, from making tobacco addictive to making food addictive. And thus was born ultra-processed food, which refers to a food adjacent you can't possibly cook in your kitchen because it's made with synthetic additives, emulsifiers, and dyes, and is highly addictive. So, once in the business of creating ultra-processed food, these tobacco giants turned food giants back to the Sugar Research Council and rigging the food pyramid, which prioritized cereal and ultra-processed carbohydrates over natural whole foods like meat, fruit, and vegetables, even though carbohydrates are the only macronutrient that are not essential for human life. And later in 2021, the dean of Tufts Nutrition School conducted a study funded by the National Institute of Health to create the Food Compass, which is currently used for dietary guidance and ranked Cheerios, Lucky Charms, and almond M&Ms higher than beef, cheese, and whole eggs and butter, making it less of a health guideline and more of an obvious advertisement for ultra-processed food producers like Kellogg's, General Mills, and PepsiCo.
So to summarize, sugar was getting criticized, so the sugar companies paid Harvard to praise sugar, which was then reflected in the Harvard food pyramid. Then around the same time, tobacco was getting less profitable, so the big tobacco companies bought the big food companies and made food addictive. So these companies then also supported the Harvard food pyramid and more recently seem to have some stake in the current food compass.
So what's the problem with ultra-processed food? Well, it includes ingredients that never existed in nature before. For example, 1. Refined sugar. Kids today eat 100 times more sugar than they did 100 years ago, and in a form that goes straight to the bloodstream, putting more stress on the pancreas and liver than they are biologically equipped to handle. 2. Ultra-processed grains sprayed with glyphosate. The processing strips off fiber, creating a simple carbohydrate chain, also known as a sugar bomb, and glyphosate is a chemical that's almost completely banned in Europe due to its carcinogenic properties and effects on the respiratory system. 3. Highly inflammatory seed oils. These are extracted with carcinogenic agents like benzene and hexane, then it's oxidized, bleached, and deodorized. Seed oils have been marketed as heart-healthy ever since Procter & Gamble bought cottonseed mills and sold cottonseed oil in the form of Crisco, and to outcompete animal fats, Procter & Gamble paid the American Heart Association to recommend seed oils over animal fats and to fund studies linking saturated fats to cardiovascular disease. Today, ultra-processed food makes up to 80% of the average American diet, and it is weaponized to make you eat more. In an experiment, rats given biologically appropriate diets don't overeat because of normally functioning satiety signals, hence there's no chronic obesity in nature. But rats, given the standard American diet, have hijacked satiety signals and compulsively eat to death. They suffer from depression, memory issues, chronic inflammation, weakened immune systems, and withdrawal when taken away. Brain scans of someone eating ultra-processed foods are indistinguishable from someone addicted to meth.
So ultra-processed food in the doses consumed by the average American harms your life, you're in denial, and you know it's bad, but you keep reaching for it. The clinical definition is addiction.
And the market is rigged. Today, the USDA says that a child eating a diet of 91% ultra-processed food is healthy, which may have something to do with the fact that 19 of 20 USDA nutrition panel members that set the guidelines of childhood nutrition are paid for by food and pharma companies. And as a result, 1 in 3 American children are overweight or obese. American children now hit puberty younger than in any other country on Earth, much of which can be attributed to obesity and hormones in the ultra-processed standard diet. Many obese children have the vascular age of 45-year-olds. And the doctors on USDA and FDA panels that oversee nutrition and obesity, like the leading obesity doctor appointed by the Biden-Harris administration, Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford, say that obesity is a genetic condition not tied to food or lifestyle. Maybe because that's what they genuinely believe, or maybe because according to the CMS website, the makers of Ozempic, Novo Nordisk, made 420,000 individual payments to obesity doctors just last year. In fact, it's nearly impossible to find an obesity doctor that hasn't received direct payments from Ozempic. These are the doctors on FDA panels that create the drug guidelines and coincidentally advocate for putting 1/4 of 12-year-olds on Wegovy, which is Novo Nordisk's slightly stronger version of Ozempic. The problem with these drugs is that they're injectable crash diets that allow you to lose the weight with no lifestyle changes, so as soon as you stop injecting them, the weight returns. And the side effects include a 9 times higher rate of thyroid cancer and severe muscle mass deterioration. But since this Danish company is one of the 10 largest contributors to US politicians, and since the FDA is 75% funded by pharma, guidelines will continue to increase drug company profits, even if that means turning a 12-year-old into a lifetime patient. The reality is most patients are on Wegovy or Ozempic indefinitely, an obesity doctor's dream. But all chronic diseases are related to greater comorbidities because the visible manifestation of the chronic disease, like obesity, is itself a symptom of metabolic dysfunction or physiological stress. For this reason, not one chronic disease treatment in history has ever reduced comorbidities if underlying habits don't change. That is why there has never been one chronic disease treatment that has lowered the rate of the very chronic disease that it treats. For example, as more Ozempic is prescribed, the higher the rate of obesity. As more metformin is prescribed, the higher the rate of diabetes. As more statins are prescribed, the higher the rate of heart disease. As more Adderall is prescribed, the higher the rate of ADHD. As more SSRIs and antidepressants are prescribed, the higher the rates of suicide and depression. 1 in 4 women are on antidepressants. Cancer rates are the highest they've ever been and are exploding amongst young people. In 1950, the US had the 13th highest life expectancy of any country. It now has the 56th, living an average of 6 years shorter than Europeans.
Something is wrong. So much can be healed by food and lifestyle, but pharma discourages root cause intervention because by medicalizing chronic disease, well, pretty much every chronic disease treatment requires a lifetime drug.
And isn't it interesting that 60% of mainstream news funding is from pharma? And the news never asked why the US had far higher COVID death rates than other developed countries. If you had healthy biomarkers like healthy weight, blood sugar, and cholesterol, you had almost 0% chance of dying of COVID.
American hospitals were never full of COVID patients. They were full of chronic disease patients whose metabolic dysfunction and comorbidities made them less resistant to COVID. COVID showed us that American immune systems are weak.
Half of adults are diabetic or pre-diabetic. A third of young adults are pre-diabetic. The age of what's considered early onset diabetes had to be dropped.
Diabetes is just an arbitrary marker of blood sugar dysregulation, meaning your cells aren't processing energy correctly.
Most people on some level have diabetes, and if you're diabetic by 30 years old, your lifespan drops an average of 14 years. And just like alcoholism is a risk factor to liver cancer, diabetes and prediabetes is a high risk factor to dementia, Alzheimer's, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer. Dementia and Alzheimer's are now considered type 3 diabetes. If you don't have blood sugar dysregulation, your chance of developing Alzheimer's is minute. And the most effective way to prevent or reverse Alzheimer's is a keto diet and exercise. Similarly, pancreatic and breast cancers are highly related to metabolic dysfunction and reversible metabolic biomarkers. In fact, 9 of 10 of the most common killers of Americans stem from preventable metabolic dysfunction.
But your doctors won't address the root cause with lifestyle change. They'll say, here's a pill to address one biomarker, but nothing to address the underlying physiology of what's happening to your body.
If you have an autoimmune disease, the standard of care is to have you on drugs and injections forever. Over 90% of healthcare spending is now on chronic disease. In 1960, it was almost 0%. And coincidentally, in 2024, 60% of Americans are affected by chronic disease, and in 1960, it was 6%.
The modern medical industry is extraordinary at acute and infectious diseases, but the problem is that it makes more money when you're sick longer and loses money when you get better. So the medical industry is incentivized to medically manage your chronic illness throughout your lifetime rather than to address the root causes and cure you.
It's also the insurance companies. Under Obamacare, insurance companies were granted the ability to raise premiums, but no matter what, they can only make a maximum profit of 15%. So if medical costs are higher, that 15% is worth more, so the insurance companies are directly incentivized to want you to have higher medical costs, meaning they're incentivized to want you to be sick more and for healthcare to be more expensive. But this is not a partisan issue. Obamacare was created by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, which first created Romney Care in Massachusetts, which was indistinguishable from Obamacare.
So knowing that food and pharma corruption is bipartisan, what do? Well, for a while, Michelle Obama was actually on the right track.
She started out targeting ultra-processed food and told kids about organic gardening and whole foods, but in 1 year, big food companies like Kraft Heinz, which was owned by the family of Obama's Secretary of State, John Kerry, pressured her to pivot to exercise, and soon she partnered with Subway. And exercise is great, but it won't cure the root cause of the chronic illness explosion. The ultra-processed foods are at the heart of the problem. Now, the political parties argue about access to the healthcare system, which is certainly important, but there is zero debate around changing the system's incentives, breaking the monopolies, and eliminating the corruption, because both sides are corrupt. That is the conversation we should be prioritizing. Australians live an average of 6 years longer than Americans and spend significantly less on healthcare and substantially more on food. Moving away from the cheap, nutritionally empty, and highly inflammatory ultra-processed foods and instead towards real, whole foods is probably a step in the right direction.
Disincentivizing long-term Band-Aid approach care by breaking monopolies and demanding that facilities have publicly accessible logs of their treatments and pricing is probably a step in the right direction.
Now, to be clear, I am not saying modern medicine is bad. It's how you use it. The same way guns are not bad if you use them for protection, but guns are bad if you use them for senseless murder. I'm also not saying doctors are inherently bad. They're humans, operating within a system, and some are aware of the system's corruption and oppose it, some are aware of the corruption and participate in it, and some just operate on the basis of their training, ignorant to conflicts of interest. That is true of humans in any system.
So now what? Well, on a political level, the best form of protection against corruption when voting is to be skeptical of establishment candidates of either party, because as we now know, food and pharma companies have effectively bought our government.
In the medical sphere, that means your government shouldn't be subsidizing long-term pharmaceutical solutions as the first line of defense against chronic illness. Your government and your media should not accept payments from private companies, and since that's not human nature because humans are corruptible, the giant food and pharma monopolies must be broken. The reason Americans are paying 4 times as much for medications than Europeans isn't the fault of capitalism. It's the fault of corruption of capitalism that resulted in the corporatism that we are battling today.
But it's important to note that no matter what happens in government, you are the captain of your own ship. And the good news is that the best form of protection against medical and food corruption and propaganda is probably common sense.
Moving your body is probably good. Staring at a screen all day is probably bad. Eating what early humans ate, like meat, animal products, whole fruits, whole vegetables, is probably better for you than something in a package or whatever fad diet is popular.
Become food literate. Learn how to read a nutrition label and an ingredients list. Shop the perimeter of a grocery store where the real food is. And note that if there's a pesticide that kills every insect on a crop, You don't need 10 years of scientific studies to prove that it probably kills some of your cells too.
Buy organic when you can, and even better, find your local farmers and develop relationships with them. Ask them about their animal husbandry. Ask them about their soil and how they grow their crops. It's generally ideal to minimize the degree of separation between you and what you consume. You control what food enters your home, and your body is also your home. I would be skeptical of those who poke fun at taking control of your health in a country suffering from a health crisis.
If I had a chronic issue and my doctor's immediate and sole response was pharmacological treatment, I would go consult other doctors and naturopaths before making a decision on how I choose to move forward. Now, this approach is a lot more mentally, physically, and maybe financially involved than just trusting the experts, but when the experts are bought, this is how you take control of the health of those you wish to protect. You are in control.